as a strength coach, as a speed coach, what do you look for in these new younger athletes that you might have seen in Christian at a young age?
We could talk about athletic abilities all day long, and I think everyone sees how super talented he is. But the mentality of what he brought to the table was.
I think a lot of guys would fall into that trap of like more is better.
It's flipping the model on its head. A young kid can handle a lot of load, and I've always told my coaches, like, we can make some mistakes with youth athletes.
Analysis was, let's get isos on his ankle while he's holding knee flexion, also feeling that same iso position when he might be doing like a march or something as he's prepping for that session.
Some of the strongest guys I've ever had in the weight room don't move very well, and they don't handle the eccentric load of sprinting. I mean, it has to be done in motion, right? I love isometrics. I think they're very valuable. If an athlete can't load in movement and then produce force in movement and handle that eccentric load,
we're going to go into everything that you need to know around speed, and we're going to start right now. Okay, so we did a podcast with Coach Brian Kula. He helped develop Christian McCaffrey, one of the best running backs in the NFL over the last decade, and we covered absolutely everything from training splits, how to handle max velocity, how to handle acceleration and deceleration. We went into specific details around drills and different concepts that you guys can use and apply today. So this podcast is absolutely loaded. Now, let's get into the podcast with Coach Brian Kula. Coach Kula, I wanted to ask you, so you've trained and truly developed Christian McCaffrey, one of the best running backs in the NFL over the last decade, right? Now, and one thing I wanted to ask you right off the bat is like, what do you look for in someone coming into the door where you're at right now as a strength coach, as a speed coach? What do you look for in these new younger athletes that you might have seen in Christian at a young age?
Wow, that's a great starting question there, my man. First of all, Christian's a little bit of an outlier. That guy has a lot of just God-given talent. But I think honestly, the thing that really separated Christian, from an early age when I got to work with him when he was 14 years old, was really his just approach to training and his intent. The way that he, took things seriously, everything from sleep to nutrition to, the way he approached the training session. We could talk about athletic abilities all day long, and I think everyone sees how, super talented he is. But the mentality of what he brought to the table was, significantly different. And, even with young athletes, you can see some similar traits in some athletes. But I think that, that's what you're looking for to really separate and identify someone as being special.
So in someone like Christian's case, like, do you think that's something that, being the fact that his dad was such a dog, is that rooted in his dad's focus as an elite athlete? Like, how would you separate that too? Because that's another interesting thing that I've thought about is like, I have parents that come in the gym, right, that are overbearing to a point, and over time it's gotten less and less to a degree because they have more trust. How do you handle that when you have someone in that case too, with Christian's dad being a former NFL guy? It's like, was that the impact that helped him with the mentality? How did you help with that mentality? Or was that just, dude, he just has the mentality?
I think the answer is yes to all. I mean, he certainly grew up in an environment that was, very competitive, high bar of excellence, a lot to live up to. Mom and dad were both really elite level, athletes. All his brothers were, athletic. And so I think it created an environment where it was very much, almost an expectation. But then I also think too, there was something, a little different about Christian himself that, we can all be exposed to those things, but are you going to take it and run with it? And I think he was a guy that, just decided early on that, I want to be the best football player that ever played. And so I'm going to do anything and everything. And then I also think too, that just the different environments that he was around, even outside of his family, the high school he went to, training opportunities, things like that. He always kind of met or exceeded the call, of what those high end, excellent environments were asking of him.
Yeah, that's okay. So that's another question I had is like, you've developed and worked with athletes in a whole, yeah, I mean, I think what was it last year you had one of the best 800 girls, and you think about Christian McCaffrey's a running back, right? One of the best running backs in the NFL, and at the same time you have an 800-meter runner, who's one of the best at the indoor national championships in track and field. And it's like, who else at the time when he was coming up were you able to sort of get around him to help with that growth pattern?
Yeah, I think Christian always did a really good job of having like role models that kind of preceded him, especially in the sport that he loves so much. He really looked at some of the great running backs, the Marshall Falks, types of the world, and really tried to model himself after what those guys did. So I think he always did a good job of putting the best around him. I've never really been around somebody that's so intrinsically motivated. And so he didn't need a lot of external. In fact, a lot of our training was done just him and I, one-on-one. Every now and again, he'd have some of his, good buddies from Stanford or teammates, from the Panthers or the 49ers come in. But really, it was always, Christian being self-motivated that was, the biggest motivator for him.
So, okay, now I want to ask you specifically around your training now, you can use Christian, but even just in general, what are you looking for? What are like key metrics as far as, let's say somebody comes in as a D tackle and you can see they have the crazy strength levels of a D tackle versus someone that might be a sprinter or a wide receiver, and speed wise, like, are there key assessments that you use to sort of dial in on where their weaknesses might be? And what would those assessments be? What are exercises that you might put someone through, like a battery of tests, that you can sort of see where they're at as far as like that snapshot of their current career?
Sure. You can get really granular on that, stuff as far as, what you're looking for from an elite level athlete to a youth athlete. I think the beauty about training is there are some things that every athlete has to have, whether they're a youth athlete or a professional high level athlete. And so some of the things are very basic, where you're looking for, what type of neural abilities do they have? Structurally, how are they built? How strong are they? Mechanically, do they move efficiently? Are they able to produce and absorb force? And, what I try to do is, find out where are they on that, profile curve, of like force velocity, load velocity profiling, and then find out where they're weak, where they're strong, and really kind of lean into the, we don't ever want to go away from their strengths. So we're going to try to make their strengths better. And then how can we elevate their weaknesses where we see they might need that? So, using some technology around a 1080 to get a load velocity profile and kind of identify where an athlete is. Are they better? Are they faster? Are they strong? Can they accelerate well? Do they have good maximum velocity? Those are assessments that we're going to run really regardless of the athlete, regardless of the sport. My philosophy of a speed priority program is that, every athlete needs a layer of that, and some are going to have different, abilities one way or the other. So it's my job to kind of figure out how are we going to lean into their shortcomings, but then also we still have to tend to the things they're good at as well, and so just simple drill work is going to look very similar for a young developing athlete as it is a professional athlete.
Okay. Off of that, you take a 1080, let's say someone's watching, they don't have access to a 1080, but you could save them and say, hey, maybe not save them. That's going a little bit aggressive. But let's say, you see potentially like someone's readings on a 1080 and their acceleration or top speed, whatever it might be, they have X, Y, or Z readings on the 1080, and then their weight room numbers or like a drill, a specific speed drill or whatever, usually is correlated to this. Do you ever see a carryover between like acceleration and a specific drill or a specific lift or anything along those lines?
Yeah, I try to, I'm a big weight room guy. I like the weight room. I don't know if there's always a 1-for-1. I've coached kids that are extremely strong that are also fast. I've coached kids that are extremely strong that don't move very well. And, so there's kind of a marriage between all of those attributes, I think, that causes somebody to be, a great accelerator or a great, maximum velocity, type of an athlete. But, I think there's just things that even if you don't have a 1080, you can run very basic assessments of a, 5'10" fly, and then a 2010 fly, and get some, draw some conclusions of, are they a good accelerator, or are they better in the top end? And so then, kind of, what type of, adaptation, or stimulus to apply to get the right adaptation to improve those qualities.
Can you explain the flies there, just for anybody who might not know?
Sure. So like a 5-10 fly for us would be like a from 0 to 5 is their acceleration. 0 to 5 yards would be their acceleration into a 10-yard fly. And so we're really working on short acceleration in that. We don't use a lot of off the line acceleration just because technology is so hard to get accurate readings. So we do a shortened acceleration zone and then capture their fly 10. And there's lots of metrics out there. There's a lot of coaches that use that. So it's easy to kind of do some comparative data to, hey, if you can hit 16, 17 miles an hour in a 5-10 fly, then we know you're a pretty good accelerator. And then conversely, if we go a little longer, like a 20-10 fly, we're going to give you a 20-yard run in into a 10-yard fly. Now we're working, looking at more max velocity, and those speeds are going to be a little bit higher. But again, we can draw comparative data to, what we would see nationally, or in an age group or something like that of, hey, if this kid hits 22 miles an hour, we know they're pretty fast in the top end. But then you can also do some comparisons. Some athletes are not very good in acceleration, but really good in maximum velocity, which, tells me they probably need some strength work, or power work in their ability to push and apply force. Whereas, conversely, if they're a great accelerator, not very good in the top end, and they may be missing some of the eccentric qualities that, take place in the braking forces, or there's some mechanical issues that are going on with how they strike the ground and ground interaction, that we're going to attack more with that athlete.
Okay, that helped. That painted that picture great. I wanted to bring up, well, I guess off of the flies, are you always looking at a fly that would typically be a 10-yard or a 10-meter, let's say, whichever 10-yard split, or would you do flies out of a longer space or not?
Typically in the training environment that I've been, in for the last, call it 3 decades, the 10-yard fly makes a lot of sense just from, it's got a lot of sport crossover. In the high level track and field athletes, we look at, longer flies like 30 meters, 60 meters, even 90 meters. But it's very sport specific to a sprinter. I don't feel like that level of, needing to hold maximum velocity for most athletes is as critical. And so we really focused on that, fly 10 mark as the kind of across the board measurement that we like to look at.
Okay. Now I got a question as far as me being specifically a weightlifting background, throwing background, growing up, my dad was a wrestler, so everything was like weight room. And if you weren't in the weight room, he would berate you and call you names. So the question I have off of that is, as far as splits are concerned, so even as far as like sprinting, when I played high school football and whatnot, it would be, we would run sprints twice a week. We'd run a hill sprint one day, then we'd just run flat sprints another day. What would a split look like? A perfect split in your case? You get a high school kid coming in, they're running a 5.5, slow as molasses 40, and we got to get them down to a sub 5. They weigh, let's say, 185 pounds. What type of split does that look like throughout the week? What are the drill days, or are there drill days? How are you managing that stress that you're going to put on them?
Yeah, it's a great question. We could probably spend an hour here, I'm sure, but I'll try to sum it up quickly. I think that, me feeling like high output is really where we're going to move the needle. And so we got to be careful of frequency. So, for us in a perfect environment, we like to have a day of recovery between the days of high outputs. So it'd be like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday setup. In our movement, we would focus the front end of the week on like acceleration, deceleration work, very much like power and strength focused. And then on Wednesday, it'd be more of a max velocity day. So we've kind of primed the system early in the week. They're not stagnant coming out of the weekend, but they're also not fatigued yet from a long week of training and practices. So we're hit that max velocity on Wednesday. And then Friday, when we, might be a little fatigued, we can get into more change direction where the speeds are a little bit lower, little lower output. Not that that doesn't require a lot of, strength and absorption and all the things that come along with change of direction, but we feel like we aren't going to risk injury there. And then we're going to pair the weight room with the theme of how our movement goes. So I love the weight room too, Dane. Like, I mean, I think low hanging fruit at some level, also something that moves the needle for a lot of athletes. But for us, the weight room has to support the movement. So if the movement is, acceleration, then we might want to work more of like, fast forces, in the weight room. And then we can be like heavier, like slower force type stuff later in the week when we can, stand to have a little bit of residual soreness on the back end of that. So coordinating the weight room with the movement pattern is really where we start from a split. So we're not a big like upper lower. We're not a big, Olympic day kind of a thing. I actually had the privilege to meet with Dan Paff, over a decade ago, and he really kind of opened my eyes to, sport. We have exposure to different movements and stimulus throughout the week, so our weight room can really have similar qualities, every day you're in there. So for us, we're typically putting some sort of a unilateral movement, a bilateral movement, some kind of explosive, hip hinging movement almost every time we're in the weight room. Now, the velocities that we move the bar at and the type of exercises that we do, those are going to change and undulate based on, the running that we're doing.
What's up, guys? You might be on your rest period right now in between your sprint-based training while you're listening to this podcast on speed from Coach Brian Kula and I. One thing that we want to do is help you guys become absolute freaks by clicking that first link in the description. Head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store, or the Apple iOS Store. And if you're in those stores, you can download Peak Strength and then make sure that you register, put in that email, and you're going to get a full week of free training. And you can select the specific sport or goal that you want to train for. So you can be training for football or soccer, or maybe you're just training because you want to get faster or improve your health. You can select athletic fitness. These are all aspects available to you inside of Peak Strength. Now, let's get back to that podcast with Coach Kula. What would be, I mean, that very clearly laid that out. So let me just recap this, because off my notes I've got Monday, let's say acceleration, decel, Wednesday max velocity, Friday you're going change of direction possibly, Monday in the weight room maybe you're doing, and this is where I guess I'd look for corrections here, is like maybe fast forces, light power cleans or something, maybe single leg squat at light load. Is there a specific day you would do more plyometrics than not?
Yeah, I mean, Monday would be a high plyometric day, or like a French contrast, with your heavier movements. So, we pair like a box jump, and again, according to where you're in your progression, it could be a depth drop, it could be a box jump, it could be a vertical jump or whatever. But that would definitely be a big Monday movement for us in the weight room.
Okay. Then Wednesday, would you do anything in the weight room on a max velocity day, or is it just, go out and also, if let's say we're pitching, I'm pitching this to you as like May or June football guy, would you hit 3 to 5 max velocity sprints, or do you think that's too much volume, too little volume? And then would they do anything in the weight room after that?
So to answer the first part of your question, I think, the volume of maximum velocity sprinting depends a lot on your output. So, if I got a world-class sprinter, we might have 1 to 2 exposures of maximum velocity before we are, now risking injury and, at some level, like the Charlie Francis model of, once you've hit a PR or you've output at a certain level, you're probably now not going to get a whole lot of return on your next couple reps. So now younger kids, youth athletes, we might be able to get 6 to 8 exposures on maximum velocity because their outputs are so much lower. So I think it's always a tug and pull on, the type of athlete you're working with and what their outputs are. But yeah, for a high school football player, in May getting ready, I'm probably no more than 3 or 4, total exposures to max velocity on a Wednesday. And then, yeah, we would get them in the weight room after their maximum velocities. And we probably then aren't really focused on fast force. We're now more, maybe it's more of a heavier strength day for us, right? Because now we've kind of compressed the load into one day. and we have some recovery time before our Friday, workout. What we wouldn't want to do is do a heavy weight room day prior to maximum velocity. So on Monday, it's important that we kind of stay away from those things that cause residual soreness, hypertrophy type stuff on a Monday, but we can get after that a little bit on a Wednesday.
Okay, so that was actually going to be one of my next questions. Was I want to go back over this. So we got a split where it's like Monday acceleration, decel, Wednesday's max velocity, Friday's change of direction, Monday in the weight room, let's say light power clean or trap bar jump, something like that, or maybe some plyo work, like as you explained, contrast work. Wednesday, they might come in and hit trap bar deadlifts or front squat or whatever, and if you have an athlete in this case, so I'm thinking about selfishly my son's 8th grade. He plays football and he's a shot putter, discus thrower. I want him to be fast, but I also know that for him to be a good shot putter, discus thrower, I need to get him to weigh 240 by his senior year, something like that. If he's gaining weight, that would let's say hypertrophy work would probably be Wednesday, and that wouldn't necessarily, like, do you think that would be good on Wednesday or Friday with that change of direction work being done on Friday?
I mean, I would probably focus more on a big strength day, like a slower force type day on Wednesday. You got your front squats, your trap bar deadlift, things that aren't going to, completely tip them over. Now, if you're looking for hypertrophy work Friday after his change of direction, that's a day to get after it. Because now you have 2 days coming of recovery, regeneration before they have to move again on Monday. And that's why we put acceleration on a Monday, is if there is any like fatigue or anything like that coming into the beginning of the week, we see, very, very infrequently do we see injury in acceleration work.
Okay, that very clearly paints the split. That's awesome. Now, my next question is, if let's say, okay, maybe this is going down the pipe dream stuff, is and for a lot of coaches listening, let's say they want to go and they want to do an NFL combine prep. Is this how you're essentially setting the week then around the combine prep? Would be like, okay, 1, 3, 5, and then what would they be doing? Is it just drills on the in-between days to manage that load, that stress? Like when you have guys coming in that frequently, how are you? Because I've been in your gym where I've seen groups, I've seen your NFL guys coming in, and I've always wondered that how you guys end up managing so many guys with so much stimulus, with so much on the line at the same time, and handling all those different factors.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's really hard for young coaches to understand is, there's always a sentiment of you got to do more to get better. And, for us, we've just gotten comfortable with, less exposures and really high output. So on those high days, we're really high. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we have really high outputs. On our low days, we're really low. So, in a training week with like a combine guy, our Tuesdays are very much centered around recovery, regeneration, mobility. We have some crawl series, rudiment type series, things that we'll do to kind of accelerate healing, accelerate recovery. And then on Thursdays, I mean, if we don't have to do anything on Thursdays, we might not. That could be a great day for a full recovery, type of a session, maybe some yoga, Pilates, type of a focus, and really take the load off of the CNS on a Thursday. Because again, you can, we all know what muscular fatigue feels like, but not many people can identify and recognize when an athlete is nervous system fatigue. And when you have CNS fatigue, now you're really set up for not only low outputs, which kind of minimizes the training exposure, but also, you're not going to have the outputs that you want. So we're always very cognizant that it's going to take a high level of CNS output when you're asking for really high outputs, especially with a potential NFL guy. And so we're just going to relax a little bit on the Tuesday, Thursday, and not feel like we have to do something just because there's a day on the calendar.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's actually, I mean, I think a lot of guys would fall into that trap of like, more is better. And do you think, and maybe this is a good question for you, is like, do you think that just comes from, coming up, you're going to be working with a lot of high school kids, a lot of middle school kids, and oftentimes the constant volume and almost being overbearing can be super beneficial, but then later it's like stepping away from that. And I'm assuming that's where that stems from, but I wanted to see what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's almost just like it's flipping the model on its head. A young kid can handle a lot of load, and I've always told my coaches, like, we can make some mistakes with youth athletes, right? You don't have to have perfect programming in there because their outputs are lower. And you would think, the lay person might be like, oh, an NFL guy can handle a whole bunch. Look at that monster. Look at that unit. He can handle anything. But the fact of the matter is they actually need less exposure. And the more you give them, the more you're risking injury. And at that level, having a healthy athlete is all that matters. You're not really moving the needle as far as you think you are with a pro athlete.
Yeah, I would even, and this is me just putting in a little sense here from my own mistake, is we've got a D2 program nearby. And if I remember, did you go to Mines?
No, I went to Northern Colorado, which was a D2 school.
Okay. So this team lost to Mines 2 years ago in the playoffs. So they're good in the semifinals. And the running back actually had, so we did a whole bunch of speed stuff, but I'm like the volume guy. And we were doing, 5 or 6 sprints every max velocity session, only once a week with the max velocity. The running back hit me up because he's on a tear, just absolutely crushing it. And he's like, dude, I didn't really start to feel really, really quick until week 2, week 3. And when I talked with our speed coach, we were sort of like, maybe we were putting too much on him, and it literally took him like 3 weeks to adapt. And now he's out just terrorizing everybody. And it's taken that step back, like, God damn, we might have fucked up a little bit. We didn't ruin him, but to a point of where he was probably overtrained quite a bit from that too many hits.
Sure. And I mean, we all get caught up in that, right? Like, I mean, that's, I've gotten to be known for some of the high end guys and gals that I've got to work with, but my whole career was based on training a bunch of 13 to 18-year-olds, and you can afford to miss and make some mistakes and maybe have a little too high a volume because their outputs are just not as high, and you're not going to make those mistakes. But as soon as the outputs start to get high, now you're kind of playing with fire.
So how did you, I wanted to ask about the like, even if you're looking at somebody like the 800 meter girl, how have you taken like your track background and been able to take that and say, okay, if I'm looking at football and I'm looking at track, and basically in my mind, like the way I paint it is like at your place, and I'm pretty sure you're in Tennessee now, if I remember correctly, I have this image of you where it's like, I put you up on a pedestal and you basically see somebody come in from any single sport. And you're like, okay, these are the 2 or 3 characteristics that this athlete needs for this specific sport. Is that from track, or is it just from the years? Like how are you able to learn those specific patterns? And is it just from training younger kids for, I guess paint that for me and what that skill require, like how you develop that skill.
Sure. I think, I'd love to tell you like I learned that early on in my career, but I didn't. It was almost just more of a, exposure over time to a bunch of different athletes in different sports. I think what I learned that if I had to like stand on a soapbox is rather than studying, like individual sport specific type things, I really look at sports from an energy system demand. What does the sport demand energy system wise, and how are we going to develop that? And that really helped me formulate my system, which whatever a system is, the things that we like to do with athletes, and the way we're going to approach it from a blank template is, athletes need to be able to accelerate. They need to be able to decelerate. They need to be able to, be exposed to max velocity. They need to be strong and all those things. And so I guess just over time, Dane, you kind of figure out what things move the needle the most, and you dive into those things deep, and then you get rid of the kind of the fluffy bullshit that might not, it might look good, it might be great posting material, and there's a lot of things that you can dive into with high level athletes when you can't do a certain amount of load, so you add in some of the really high level look at things you can do in isometric work and stuff like that. But just over time, I think I stopped looking at athletes from what sport they played and started looking at more from, okay, we're working with a bunch of tennis players right now, for example, and it was really easy for me very early on to see, man, this is one of the most decelerative sports I've ever been around. So, we better be really good in our eccentric loading, um, for these guys to be able to push in and out of all the times they have to move on the court. And it's not that hard for me, to go, well, that's not a track athlete, but we still want to expose them to max velocity because every athlete needs that exposure because now you're really training the brain, right? And what athlete doesn't need, neural enhancement? We've seen it help golfers swing a golf club harder. We've seen it help swimmers swim faster. I would say same thing for, you're the throws expert, but I think throwers need to sprint, right? Because again, there's just a neural response there where the CNS is going to help coordinate, all the things that are, happening. And there's nothing you can do on the planet that's more coordinative and demanding on the CNS than sprinting. So, when I built my priority around speed, that was really why. And I guess maybe kind of backing into it, I found that, man, this really helps hockey players and swimmers and golfers. And, so I just don't look at it from, what that athlete does. Even with my 800-meter runner, I'm like, hey, we need to cut some of your volume and make sure that, we're training speed. And she had 3 of her best 800-meter times in her career, in an 8-year professional career, with about half the mileage that she had been operating at previously. So it's kind of probably for me been easy now to say I can point back to a dozen or more professional athletes and we've run a similar system with, and it's helped all of them. And it's helped me solidify my, my philosophy around these are the things that most athletes are going to need.
So if you're taking that, okay, let's take that. If we're saying everybody needs speed, priorities around speed, it's the greatest way to recruit your entire body neurologically, and even to the point where we'll see acceleration improve just from working max velocity. What would be like the best drills to prep somebody? Because when you initially said the sprinting, I think about my guys who we will run 15s or 20s, and we'll use a 1080. We haven't run max velocity yet, though, and I'm thinking through this, and I'm going, okay, how could I prep them so that my big hosses aren't blowing out their hamstrings, running with terrible technique, or whatever it might be. But how, what would those like 3 to 5 sprint drills be for prepping them for that max velocity work, or is it just more about like slowly building into that?
No, I mean, the series that we developed called the Bounce Fire series for us is really our, what I would call kind of our IP or our special sauce that we use with almost every athlete. And really what we're doing there is it's a neural, it's a mechanical and a structural approach to not only like helping an athlete move better, but also potentiating them into their speed work. So we use it as part of our ramp process. After we go through a locomotion and a dynamic flexibility and all that kind of stuff, we run right into our Bounce Fire series, which can be run linear, lateral, change of direction. But really we're teaching the athlete, basically the 2 phases of sprinting, right? I mean, you're in the air or you're on the ground. And so, we're teaching them how to potentiate and, load their foot, where to strike their foot, the timing of pushing through their foot. So mechanically, we're getting them dialed in. Neurologically, it's a high stimulus. They're getting thousands of ground contacts through that, so they're developing some resiliency in their ankle, joint. We're trying to prevent them from leaking forces, because we spend all this time in concentric, force output. But if they can't handle that and eccentrically, then they're going to, have force leaking all over the place. So it doesn't really matter. And then just structurally that the joint's strong. We don't have, heel drop and things like that at ground contact. So that Bounce Fire series for us, I just spoke on this last weekend in Austin. If I had to throw everything out the window and do nothing but that Bounce Fire series for 30 minutes a day, it would be enough to move the needle, especially for the youth athletes, to start to develop the qualities that's going to help them run faster.
Okay, so I'm going to do a full YouTube video on Brian Kula's Bounce Fire series, and I'm gonna try and get you to sign off on this. But I'm going to give everything the Bounce Fire series brought to you by Brian Kula.
Let's go.
Okay, you brought up an ankle drop, a heel drop, and this is perfect. The D2 school, we got a sprinter last year. I think he ran like 10.55, 100, solid bigger dude, but solid.
Yep.
He's running accelerations outside yesterday. He's been with us, he grew up basically. So his older brother is the starting running back at Penn State, Dog. And this kid sort of just blossomed a lot later and now has gotten into training pretty hard. And so yesterday he's running sprints, and Legends, our speed guy, comes over and he's like, yo, can you check out Sean's movement? So I'm looking at it, and as he's sprinting, his right heel's dropping, his left heel's doing well as he's accelerating.
Yep.
And I'm looking at it, okay, his right heel's collapsing from on his third, fifth, and seventh step. Pretty bad.
Yep.
How do you see this? Walk me through the way walk me through your process of analyzing movement, and then how you would alleviate that issue.
Sure. I mean, I think obviously for me it's a little different because I've been running the Bounce Fire series for 20 years, and so I put a kid through that, and I can kind of start to see those qualities like before we even start sprinting. But I think film analysis, right? Just filming a kid and then being able to go back and know what you're looking for from shin angles to are they yielding in their heel and having that collapse at the bottom. It's pretty easy to see when you slow it down. So I think another way to do that, if you have a 1080 or if you have even just bands, to put somebody into a band and slow them down in some of the drill work, just so that they can feel those movements and a coach can see them a little bit better. We always want to go faster, but sometimes by slowing it down, you actually see a lot more. So for us, it would be the progressions of the Bounce Fire series that would start to show, because we run everything unilateral. So it's really easy to see, like you said, he's having a hard time on the right side. Well, we'd be able to really address that through that series, because we're going to do everything unilateral and be able to address one side of the body.
Okay. Even just thinking through that, because one of the things Legend brought up, he's like, immediately, the thought was like, for Legend's analysis was, let's get some isos on his ankle while he's holding knee flexion and hip flexion, which I think is accurate to a point. And if we can set up the context, though, that also feeling that same iso position when he might be doing like a march or something as he's
Exactly.
prepping for that session.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would come from the school of thought that it has to be done in motion, right? I love isometrics. I think they're very valuable. But if an athlete can't load in movement and then produce force in movement and handle that eccentric load, again, some of the strongest guys I've ever had in the weight room don't move very well, and they don't handle the eccentric load of sprinting. I mean, what is Soleus, like 9x your body weight in sprinting?
Yep.
So that's a huge load to be able to handle when the ground interaction happens. And we see a lot of athletes that collapse in that, and I think there's even more research, coming down the pike now of, what's more important, concentric or eccentric, abilities in sprinting. Because in the highest end, when you're moving that fast, there really is, I saw Les Spellman this weekend present that, there's about a 50% eccentric force load and a 50%, concentric force load in max velocity. But yet we all tend to kind of focus and concentrate on the concentric load of being able to push. But if we can't handle it, then, we never are able to express, speed at its highest level.
What's up, guys? Our podcast and our channel are sponsored by our own strength training app, Peak Strength. The entire focus of Peak Strength is to provide you guys with the absolute best sports performance app that you could ever imagine. We build out the programs on the back end. We take in all of these different decisions that we learned here on site at Garage Strength so that we can then apply it to you so you can improve your training. So if you guys want to improve your overall sports performance, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. Download Peak Strength. You'll get a free week of training, and then you can start getting on those gains, get those reps done so that you can become a champion. Now, let's get back to the video. Peace. I think that brings up like an interesting point, because I was just thinking about Jonathan Edwards, the world record holder in the triple jump, and I'm like, the weird part is a guy like that never was exposed to as much data as we have now, and it's like, is it that he was just so well trained and such a freak that he was able to carry that speed. Even Christian Taylor arguably like was not exposed to the amount of data at the end of his career, yes, but he had already been injured. And I'm thinking through that in the lens of like being able to handle insane eccentric forces. Cause I like to think through, all right, if you got a triple jumper, they're taking it more than anyone.
Yep.
And it's like, what if they would have done more eccentric work? Would that have helped or hurt? I always
Sure.
like to play that game. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
No, 100%. I mean, I think the triple jump is a great example of a sport that's, I mean, you better be really good in the eccentric, phase of being able to handle those forces. Those guys that are jumping close to 18, 19 feet per phase and handling that. I mean, Jonathan was not a specimen, right? I mean, he was kind of a little guy, but
Yeah.
I'm guessing he was wound like a top, as far as his tendons and ligaments and his abilities to handle those forces. I bet you there's guys that could, put out more than him in a concentric phase, but if you're not able to handle that, then it's all for naught. So I think having a balance in that is super critical.
Yeah, I think that's also where I've failed, maybe not failed, but struggled is like you because I've talked with guys tight or close with Edwards, tight or close with Holm. I'm close with a triple jump coach who coached the Olympic champ last year. And they'll talk about Edwards. And I think this is the failure of American strength coaches, especially weight room based ones like myself, is we'll say Edwards could clean 150 kilos. So we'll say everybody's got to clean 150 kilos. But instead of saying that, it's like Edwards could clean 150 and Edwards was helped likely by his clean, but that's not what made him a great triple jumper.
Right.
And it's taking that step back and being, and almost like what you had said with football guys, like there's some football guys that are just savage in the weight room, but they run like dog shit. And it's like, it's really playing that fine line. And I guess that leads to my next question is sometimes I'll see really, really strong guys do well when they do resisted sprints at a certain load. Where do you see the load, like if you would decrease, or where is the heaviest load that you would be willing to put on, let's say a sport like football or a wrestler, even like where you might be like, all right, after this, it's not really worth it. It's going to be too slow.
Yeah. That's changed for me a little bit. I mean, a lot of education with the 1080 and being able to play around with that, piece of equipment. I think, we'll run up to a 50% decrement on their speed. So, that requires us to run a full load velocity profile and know where their numbers are. But then we would, add enough load to get them to 50% of their max speed. So that's a pretty heavy load. And when we do that, we are not, it is not a technical model type of a training session. If we're running at those kind of loads, that's almost a power environment. I always used to operate in the track and field world of, we did a lot of resisted sprinting, but I never really liked more than about 10% of their body weight. And most of that came out of just not wanting to, interfere with mechanics. Because I think anything over 10%, you got to be, very aware of, mechanics are going to change a little bit when you start to add that kind of load. So a lot of it just has to do with, what's your desired outcome. If it's just for power output and, concentric force loading, then you can probably go up to that 50%. I think if you're really working on maximum velocities and, just trying to slow down a little bit proprioceptively, trying to feel the positions and stuff, then I think 10% is probably more in alignment.
Okay. So it's mainly going to be around though, the decrement of the speed. So if someone's running, just throwing random numbers out, let's say they run a 30, let's say they run a 30 at just 3 seconds, and that goes to become a 6-second 30. We would not want to see it be any slower than that 6-second 30 in that case.
Correct. Yep.
I wanted to make sure my math was sort of accurate on that. Actually, no, wait. Would it be?
We'd want them to have. So we operate a lot on miles per hour. So if we know an athlete is a 20 mile an hour athlete, the slowest we'd want them going with the load down to 10 miles an hour.
That's way easier for my brain to comprehend. Okay. Let's say, so what are the biggest differences? Like you get a young kid coming in the door now with like 13, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds. What is like the best way to, or the biggest thing that you see now with kids that you think everybody's sort of lacking as far as body awareness, that it's like, what, like, we need kids to do this more, that you're seeing they might be lacking in their overall physical development?
I mean, I do always come back to our Bounce Fire series. It's almost like a built-in assessment for us to be able to see what kind of qualities the kids have from coordination, number one. Number two is, are they strong enough in their, lower half to even be able to hit some of those positions that we're asking them to be in. We get to see some exposure to the CNS over, that. So I don't know if there's like a single quality. I mean, obviously with young athletes, strength is always the low hanging fruit, so if an athlete gets stronger, they're going to move better, more efficiently. But I think through that Bounce Fire series, what we found is, it exposes all the qualities that a kid may or may not have. So, a lot of times coaches will refer to it as like being bouncy or twitchy. And I think that in and of itself is a quality that you see in most high level athletes. And really that is all of those things culminated in one thing. Do they load well? Do they react to the ground well? Is there timing? Is the nervous system firing? And so we get to kind of see all that just through a single set of drills.
Okay. I had in my notes, I had a little pivot here. I want to go back to the theoretical combine group. And let's say you have a guy that runs a really good 5.10.5 and they run well in the 40. How are you, but their vert is not as good as it could be. Let's say they've got a 30-inch vert. We need to get them to, or 32. We need to get them to 35 or something like this, right? Would you alter the speed training in that case to try and push the vert, or keep the speed going because they're successful and try to add some like certain vert aspects to increase their vertical?
I would not reduce the speed work at all, because I think it's also going to be a component that's going to help their vertical jump. And you don't want to get away from the things that they're good at. So for those two reasons, I would continue the speed work. I think with vertical jump, obviously there's a different profiling of how fast they absorb and push off the ground that you could look at, and then also a technique. I mean, I've seen guys improve 3-4 inches in a vertical jump just by enhancing their technique of how they jump. So those are things that you could add in that wouldn't even add to the load, but just to work on some technical side of that specific exercise.
Okay, that's good. All right, I want to ask you a slight pivot now into some like a business question, and I think I look at your direction or your career from the outside looking in, and this is just totally from my viewpoint, is like, you're somebody who's been on the ground. You developed the absolute best of the best. Like, you've made it as far as a strength coach is concerned. And I actually talked to you a little bit about this the first time we met, where I was like, I feel like there's this thing where it's, as you come up as a strength coach or as a speed coach, performance coach, how do you balance like being successful in developing athletes and also at the same time making money? And then you're like, you focus on making money, and then you come back and you're like, man, I really like coaching. And it's like, how do you establish that balance, if you have, and what advice might you have for other coaches?
Oh man, maybe don't ask my wife that question. I don't know if there's been any balance whatsoever.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I've been asked that a lot. I get a lot of young coaches that ask like, hey, I want to train, NFL athletes. How do I get there? What's the path? And I do feel like I've been blessed and fortunate to have had, like some things fall in my lap at some level. You never really know what situation you're going to be in, where those things are going to come across your plate. And then I think, part of it is being resilient enough and having thick enough skin to handle both of those things. I mean, I read something one time that said 99 or an entrepreneur, there's a reason why there's only 1% of business owners, because it would kill the other 99%. And I believe that, and you probably could, agree with what you do from you're trying to manage and balance. And when you get a pro athlete, when you get somebody really high level, they want more of your time. They want you at their location. There's a lot of travel involved, but yet you're still trying to manage a family, a business, like all the things. And I'd love to tell you that I had a great game plan for it. I think I just at some level had a big engine, and failure was never going to be an option, and I was going to try to get it figured out. So I do think they play into each other. Obviously, working with 5 to 10 elite pro athletes helps your business, right? So there's that. And then also too, be completely remiss if I didn't say you got to put good people around you. I've had an unbelievable team in my business structure that has helped run the business and grow the business, while I was able to spend 2-3 months at a time with Christian out of state and things like that. So you have to put the right things in place and not think you can do it all by yourself. I think is critical. And then some luck, and some of God's blessings to put some of those things and entrust it to you, and then do a good job with them when you have them.
I was gonna say, when you told me your flight schedule, and like, dude, I fly a lot. And when you told me your flight schedule, I think it was last year, I was like, dude, get out of here. That's insane. And the balance of that, I mean, is as you said, I think it's a support system, and your spouse and stuff like that, I think is huge. I wanted to go 2 more questions. Last, since you've been in the world of sports performance, what would you say are like the two, like what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen since you got in, and versus if you could say to your 25-year-old self versus now, like, yo, be ready for this. This is going to change, and this is something that you should prep for and get on it ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to sound maybe a little self-serving, but I mean, I think the idea of speed, which is something that, for me as a track coach and a track athlete, I've been chasing speed for 30 years. So it's nothing new to me necessarily, but I do think that the industry has, over the last couple decades, has realized how important it is. There's been a lot more attention and detail, given to it. I think, my dad, who was a NSCA original member, Russian Eastern Bloc training kind of stuff, was a big weight room guy. And again, I always preface that by saying I love the weight room. I think the weight room is a great place to develop athletes. But I think, understanding that the weight room is a support tool and not necessarily maybe the training modality, that's what I have seen change. I still feel like, you give me an open field and a couple athletes, and we can get some stuff done, which is a heck of a lot cheaper than building out a weight room.
Yes, 100%. Okay, last question, because you mentioned this earlier about Christian. You actually brought up with Christian how he essentially had, these role models, looking up to someone like Marshall Faulk, which I was sitting there thinking, like, man, imagine that, like a role model, somebody, you're looking at someone like Marshall Faulk. Who would be role models that you would recommend that that are role models to you that other people could potentially learn from and grow from, as you have yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my number one role model was my father, who passed about 8 years ago. And I think he epitomized like what the art of coaching was. I don't know that he was the best technical coach, but that guy knew how to capture the hearts of kids and was always trying to get better, kind of in a growth mindset. I think I got those qualities from him. I also got to see a tremendous work ethic. And I think those things really helped me, in my career. Beyond that, from like a role model, I think the other people that I have been more of mentors and people that I've looked up to and tried to copy, things that they've done. Some of them are people no one's ever heard of. Mark Rohde was my first boss at Greeley West High School. He was unreal at, how he spoke into athletes and kind of structured his life around sports and stuff. Tony Wells is a track coach that I took most of my training protocols from. And he was just a youth track club coach, that happened to be here in Denver. And I kind of had the guts to reach out and want to learn from him. And he was gracious enough to share a bunch of his stuff with me. So, the Vince Andersons, the Les Spellmans, the Tony Hollers, there's a laundry list of people. I've never been like isolated in my own silo trying to figure this stuff out on my own. I have begged, borrowed, and stolen almost everything, that I do. And then, put it into my, how I go about, how I treat athletes and interact with athletes.
All right, that's awesome. I love hearing that. I think a lot of people, a lot of coaches can relate to that. Coach Cool, I want everybody to know where can they find you, and if they want to pay a ton of money to get trained by you, where can they get trained by you? Where can they find you? Where can they engage with the stuff that you're doing out there in the world?
Yeah, so I'm in a little bit of a transition phase in my career right now. We still have our headquarters in Denver that my team is running back there. So Kula Sports Performance is alive and well in Denver. We have some amazing coaches there. I'm currently in Nashville, Tennessee. We're building a sports complex that's got a performance facility. I'm here with Cody Hughes and our staff that we've hired. We'll be open probably next summer at 26. We're building out right now. But we have a little facility we're operating out of right now. And so if you're in the Middle Tennessee area, we'd love to talk to you. And probably the easiest way to reach me is just, through either our website, kulasp.com, or hit me up on our new Farm and Forge Club website.
Farm and Forge is the website?
That's right. Yeah. The Farm and Forge Club.
Okay. All right, Coach Cool, thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. You answered every question I had laid out here. Everybody, pester him on Instagram. Make sure you like all of his posts. And again, Coach Cool, thanks for doing this.
Thanks, Dane. Appreciate you, man.
All right, peace.
Peace.